Now, if you know Lincoln's history, how much does he really take part?
One battle.
Never even. The only Indian he claims to have seen is an old Indian that stumbled into his militiaman's camp, and he actually saves him from getting lynched by his militiamen and saves him. That's the story. So that's the only Indian he claims to have seen. He drove a wagon of supplies. Okay. But this is his image, right? The rail splitter. Of course, another way of getting whites out west was the railroad. And Lincoln's biggest payment as a lawyer is $5,000 from the Illinois Central Railroad. I mean, that's his biggest gig as a lawyer he ever gets, is this one this one railroad contract. So he's a very big supporter of railroads, although he'll be a lawyer against railroads. I mean, he goes on both sides. If you read about Lincoln the lawyer, it's kind of this conundrum. But again, Indians never cross his mind, really. This is unjust. He doesn't write anything about Black Hawk War being unjust. He doesn't worry about whether the railroad is unjust. When he fights the Kansas-Nebraska Act in '54, if you remember the Kansas-Nebraska Act, it's about the railroad Douglas wants to build from Chicago to California. He fights it because of popular sovereignty and the allowing of possibly slavery in the Kansas Territory, which of course leads to Bleeding Kansas and all that thing. Anybody know where the original idea of popular sovereignty in the territories came from? Lewis Cass, governor of Michigan. Interesting. So, go ahead, thanks. This is the best picture I could get. I don't know if y'all can see this, but this is the angel of heaven. And what's below? Pioneers. The pioneers. And what is the term we usually commonly use for that?
Manifest destiny.
Manifest destiny. Expansionism. America is still an expansionist country. Is it always good? Well, it depends on who you talk to, right? McDonald's in Kuwait, is that a bad thing? Well, good answer. It depends who you talk to, right? So this idea of expansion, of expanding American businesses, and sending Americans out west, to expanding American business, to expanding American influence throughout the world, is common throughout American history. It's nothing new. Is it a good thing or a bad thing? Well, that's a debate we could have. But students can get into the inevitability of what we do now, and they can base that on history that is very expansionist. So the idea of manifest destiny is taking place. And that causes a lot of friction with American Indians. I used this example of a friend of mine wrote a dissertation about American Indians in the lumber industry. And with here, what would happen when settlers would come to Traverse City? He's from Traverse City, so he wrote about Traverse City. So what do the Indians in Traverse City largely do in the winter? Do you guys know the history of that at all? They'd go south. They come into the Holland area largely, or they go even further south in the winter so that they could be warm, obviously. And then they go back to their houses in the spring to Traverse City. Well, what starts happening is when they start going back north, what do they find in their houses? White settlers. Now what do you do? Any ideas what you'd do if you found a white settler in your house when you came back from your winter? You shoot them. Yeah, that's what happens sometimes. And how well does that go over with law enforcement? Usually gets them in jail or killed themselves, correct? Any other recourse you had? There's two other recourses you have.
Court.
What?
Court.
Court. Traverse City, where would you go to court? And that's a good answer, because it happen, but rarely. Where would you have to go to court if you're a Traverse City Indian in the mid-19th century?
Detroit.
Detroit. If you knew what court was. Right? It's always that famous what-if question. What if they'd have gone to Detroit? Well, they'd have to know what court was, they'd have to know what a lawyer was, and they have to know what even ownership of land meant. Which they do have an idea of that. And they do have actually some deeds set out. But they'd have to go all the way to Detroit to force white people out of their land. And then hopefully the Traverse City sheriff would go kick these people out, which, how likely is that? There's no recorded cases of that actually happening. So this what if. And then the third course is just to move, which is what a lot of them did. And then a lot of them gather and they get angry and they have a war. And a lot of times when Indians fight wars, they don't just kill soldiers, do they? That's where you get into this victimization part that's not always true. They often kill civilians, they'll rape women, and they will kill children at times, white children, which creates this whole mentality of terrorist or evil doer. Even though, were they driven to do that? Well, that's a debate we could have for the next 5 years. But it's a good debate to make your students think. Okay, thanks. Now, Lincoln the president, this is right before his inauguration. How do we know it's right before his inauguration?
No beard.
Doesn't have his beard from was the girl from Pennsylvania or New York? Wrote in the letter saying he looked too young. So he grows his beard. So what do we know about Lincoln the president and American Indians? Anybody know? Well, first of all, he's got the Civil War fighting. The government will spend in the Civil War 11 times all the combined budgets of the federal government prior to his presidency to fight the Civil War. So it's a huge expansion of war. You've got a war that's going to kill more Americans than any other war, almost any other war combined, and yet he has to worry about American Indians? Well, remember, his big push is westward expansion, right? The Homestead Act, the biggest welfare program in American history, is passed under, which probably a lot of our relatives benefited from, is passed during the Civil War. And that's huge westward expansion. So let me just give you these statistics. Between 1860, there were 2 million people in the West, meaning west of the Indian Territory. 2 million people in 1860 to nearly 9 million by 1890. It is the largest migration of in American history. During that same period, 1860, 1890, 7 territories became states. Agriculture, cultivation in the 33 years after 1860 exceeded that of the previous 2.5 centuries combined. So American Indian Territory and hunting grounds shrank year after year, making white and American Indian conflict inevitable, and the latter's extinction possible. That's something we also have to consider. People say reservations are terrible, at least native-centric people do. Well, what was the alternative to extinction? Because there's definitely discussion that American Indians could become extinct. Why would they say that? Well, look at the East Coast and the power of tribes in the East Coast. There's almost no agency, although it's coming back to some extent. Back then, there was none. So the age-old government policy of protecting American Indians and citizens' rights while encouraging westward expansion, proved pretty much infeasible. How do you do that? How do you encourage westward expansion? And why is Lincoln encouraging westward expansion? Anybody know? Well, he wants white settlers out there because then no slaves will want to come. No people want to bring their slaves out there. If you got these white free labor farms, there's no way you're going to want to bring your slaves out there because they're going to escape. That's the whole idea of the Freeport Doctrine that gets Douglas canned basically as the Democratic nominee for president in the 1860s. This doctrine of we're going to send all these white people out west, and if you just don't encourage slavery, slaves won't come around. And that's what Lincoln's trying to do. And he actually Congress banned slavery in the territories fairly quickly after the Homestead Act. So he's got his purpose. Does that make sense? Also, he saw the Homestead Act as a way to get disgruntled whites from the North out of the states that were protesting the war and get them out west. But mostly it was that there would be no question of the expansion of slavery after the Homestead Act. So it makes sense. But the problem is these settlers are settling on American Indian land, and it leads to conflict. He hires his Commissioner of Indian Affairs, and back then it was very common, I would not blame Lincoln for this, to appoint your friends as the government posts. And William Dole from Illinois, who has no experience with American Indians, we can't even tell if he ever met an American Indian prior to becoming Commissioner of Indian Affairs. He wrote, "When the red and white races occupy the same territory, the former is quickly contaminated by the vices of the latter, rapidly deteriorates in physical and mental power, and very soon becomes nigh extinct." So there is this fear among Lincoln and Dole in a paternal sense, and actually I believe a good sense, that if we keep encouraging westward expansion, don't do something about it, the conflict will lead to defeat for the American Indians militarily and then possibly extinction. And that's when Dole and Lincoln begin to really push the idea of reservations. They're set up a little bit before that, but Lincoln's going to be the initiator. Of course, he's killed prior to really initiating major reform in Indian policy. And then Grant will follow up and create this huge reservation system that we have today.